everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alex Burdett, and I'm here on behalf of the Agricultural Genomics Action Center, or AgAct for short. We're really pleased to be hosting this session today and have you with us. For those who may be new to AgAct, AgAct is an innovative knowledge mobilization hub supporting Genome Canada's climate smart agriculture and food systems research portfolio. This national initiative brings together partners across academia, industry, and government to advance climate smart innovation in Canada's agri-food sector. Key part of our work at AgAct is strengthening knowledge translation and ensuring research leads to meaningful outcomes for producers, communities, and the broader economy. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. Please feel free to share any questions you may have throughout the session in the chat. We'll be monitoring them as they come in, and we have some time at the end of today's session for some Q&A. And if you'd like closed captions in either French or English, you can turn those on at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And today's session will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel within the next week or so. Now, on to today's topic. Research impact can often feel intangible, but we're here to tell you it doesn't have to be. Today's session is all about making impact more accessible, practical, and achievable for researchers at any stage. Whether you're designing a new project or looking to strengthen existing work, we hope this session helps you move from intention to action. And we're very fortunate to be joined by our speaker today, Sarah Morton. Sarah is an internationally recognized expert in impact assessment and evidence use, celebrated for her highly cited research impact and her practical, accessible approaches to understanding complex change. With over 3 decades of experience across the public sector, charities, and universities, she's helped organizations, including AgAct, enhance their impact by making better use of data, develop meaningful theory of change, and crafting credible, actionable stories about the difference they make. Welcome, Sarah. With that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you everyone for coming today and talking about impact. As you might imagine, I'm a little bit of an impact nerd, and so it's a subject I always like to have the opportunity to talk about. So let's get started. So what I want to cover in today's session is what I'm calling 3 keys for understanding and also assessing research impact. So I'm going to talk about mechanisms for impact. I'm going to talk about the importance of people and thinking through how people are at the heart of impact. And I'm going to share a framework that helps you really think through, well, what impact might my work have? And there's going to be some examples and some practical tools as we go through. And there's going to be some space for questions, a couple of little bits of interaction. And for those of you who are from AgAct who are joining me for the workshop in a couple of weeks' time, there's some things that you can do that I need you to do between now and then that are going to be the foundation for what we do when we get together then. Alex already gave me a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. But I suppose what I wanted to say is I got into really thinking about impact in the way that I'm going to talk about today in this session because I was working in a role at the University of Edinburgh, a research centre, which was a multi-institution research centre that aimed to really influence a new Scottish government. I think I said I'm in Edinburgh here, and it was when there was a new Scottish government. And so I found myself in this role of, helping researchers get their research into policy or practice, and hosting events and running round tables and doing co-producing projects with different practice or policy organizations. And I got really into thinking, this is all good, but is it actually making a difference? Like, how do we know this is the right thing to do? So I did a midlife PhD on what is research impact and how can it be assessed. And so that's how I got into helping lots of people with their impact, not just research organizations, but also other organizations as well. And I'll explain a little bit more about kind of what came out of that as we go through. But I thought it might be quite fun to start off with asking you to rate your own expertise on research impact. So how much do you think you know? And so we've got this question about how expert are you? And maybe if you could just fill up the poll there. we have I've only given you four categories. I hope you feel you can fit into one. You know what it's like with boxes. There's always somebody who won't fit in. But could you answer the answer that question, and then um, Alex will share the results as they start coming in. So I don't know if you can we share the results? Are they coming in? I've just can't.
Yep, just waiting for a couple more responses to trickle in.
I think it'll come in live, will it or not?
I think I'm only able to share the results once
Okay,
that's
okay. So has
completed.
everyone had a chance to vote on that?
Last call. Okay.
Okay, so we've got a few beginners, some people with a little knowledge. Oh, and there's at least, well, I don't know how the percentages work out because we're not very many people. At least one person, or maybe two, say they're an expert. So that's great. I hope even the experts will get something out of this session. So thank you for sharing that. We've got another bit of interaction a little bit later on. And I thought before we get into this like first key for impact, I would just briefly talk about how we think about impact. And this is very much building on the work I was mentioning in my PhD. So the way I think about impact and the definition that I use is this very process-led definition because we quite often get stuck in what I call research uptake, which is all the ways we get people interested in research by publishing or sharing or holding events or working with people. All really important things, but on their own, they're not impact. They're the ways that we get research out into the world. And it's really then what those people do in terms of sharing or do something with it or discussing it or changing their views or applying it. And I've used that term sort of lightly. That really leads to change, which is really where research impact is. And you'll see I've put a contribution to change because the approach I use is based on contribution analysis, which I'll say a bit more about later. Because on its own, research really just causes change, but it contributes to change in quite kind of complex ways. So I'll be drawing on this definition as we go through the session just now. So the first key I want to talk about is like, what are the mechanisms for impact? What actually happens? How does research actually get into having an impact? And I suppose the way I think about it, and I'm going to explain this in a bit more detail, is like, what is the vision for change that your particular area of work is interested in, or the problem that you want to address? So, what is it that you're really trying to tackle with your research? And then, what are the processes or mechanisms that might facilitate change based on what you're doing in your research? How are you going to promote research so people are listening and interested to it? And also who really needs to engage with it, which is kind of where we get into the second key. But deliberate planning and having this clear vision are the real foundation for impact tracking. It's very difficult to have an impact if you don't set out to have an impact. And I think that's been quite well proved in the literature. So I've come up with these 5 ways that I think research has an impact. And you'll see slightly different versions of this in different kinds of publications. But if you have another way that you think that isn't represented here, please tell me, because I've been testing this out with different people. So if you think there's something you do that means research has an impact that's not represented here, I'd love to hear about it. So research can have an impact through policy or practice influencing in different ways. It can have an impact through co-production, so working closely with a non-academic organization can lead to impact in various different ways. Sometimes it's about public engagement, and I've put a little icon here of people looking at a picture, but of course public engagement is much broader than exhibitions. It's science festivals and social science festivals and lots of different ways, theatre, drama, many ways of engaging the public. Sometimes it's through community engagement. Often that community engagement is the community around an institution, but not only that, it can be other communities as well. And then sometimes it's working with industry, and actually working with industry is a form of policy or practice influencing of that industry or organization. But it's quite good to call it out separately, because I think a lot of people doing work more in that space maybe wouldn't think of themselves as influencing policy or practice, but they're influencing the policy and practice of particular organizations or industries. So what does this look like in practice? I've got some examples. So this is an example. Some people working a, a group I actually worked with whose research was on children's experiences online. So they were interested in finding out children's experiences, good and bad, online. Become quite a topical topic over the last few years. So what they were really interested in, children being safer and happier online. That's kind of ultimately what they want to do with this research. So how are they going to do that? Well, influencing policy, because obviously there's a regulatory environment around children's experiences online. There's also national policy, there's international policy. So there's loads of policies that apply to this space. There's maybe governments making policies like the Australian government saying that young people can't use social media. But they also might work with industry. So they might work with one of the tech industries or one of the tech, some part of industries that are providing tech environments to help them use the research to improve their policies and their practices so that children can be safer online. So it doesn't only have to be one path, one mechanism. It can be more than one mechanism that you're working with at the same time. And then this is a real example. I was working with somebody at a university who was very skeptical about some of the things around thinking through impact, but because he was doing research on AI in aviation, and he was like, well, I know how this is going to have an impact. It's going to make flying safer and more efficient, and it's going to do that through working with my industry partners. But through the process of thinking through it a bit more, he realized, well, his industry partners couldn't really change some things. It had to be changed in policy first. So then he realized, okay, I need to also influence policy. I can't just work with industry. One of my long-term colleagues does a lot of research with people with dementia, so acting with them to do research. And her research, or her kind of vision for change, is that people with dementia get the support they need, whatever setting that's in. So she is co-producing with those people with dementia. So they are together doing research, which means that their views and their perspective on the world is very much embedded in the research, which means it's better at influencing practice because it's very practical and very focused on what people need. So then she also is involved in practice influencing for some of the settings where people with dementia might be living or working. This is one where some researchers who are doing research on deep neural networks. Some of you in the room will probably understand this a lot better than I. It's really not my specialism. But they were like, well, how on earth is our work ever going to have an impact? It's really not. It's way too blue skies. It's not something that can be applied. But actually, what they did care about was that genomics research was understood and supported, so that people didn't go, oh no, genomics, we shouldn't be researching that, so that there was a better understanding. So they got involved in public engagement through things like science festivals, which wasn't necessarily about the thing they were currently researching, but was slightly broader around why genomics research is important and the sorts of things that it's doing. So even people who were doing quite scientific research, pure science research. So for example, it's quite common for pure science researchers to be interested in getting more children to choose science pathways. So it might not be about their research in particular, but it might be about doing public engagement so that more children want to take that journey onto science pathways, which I know certainly here in Scotland is something that is a bit of a problem, that there's quite a small demographic of people who are going in that direction at the moment. And then community engagement. I was talking to someone at a university here in Edinburgh, actually, that is the campus for this university is in a poorer area of the city, and he's a methodological specialist. So he has this very narrow specialism, which is all about pushing forward the way we do some particular aspects of social science. So again, he was somebody who was like, well, my actual research is not applied, it's not going to have an impact, but he did get involved in some of the community engagement work that the university was doing. So the university, in order to improve relationships with the local community, would give researchers time to go and work with those communities to do their own research or investigate things that they were interested in. And of course, any social scientists with basic training could help with that kind of work. So that's one way that community engagement happens. So why do we want to have this clear vision and this clear mechanism? Well, it keeps our attention on potential impact rather than just activity. So rather than getting very busy with, oh, we're doing a science festival, oh, we're doing a science festival because this is what we care about, or getting very busy with running events and sharing research or translating findings into plainer language. It gives us some clarity, so it makes it very explicit what it is we're trying to do, and we can share that across the people involved. It can help align partners and stakeholders around a common goal. So if you're working with an external agency, you say, okay, well, what we're all interested in here is children being happier and safer online. So we can all align around that, and the researchers bring their part to that, and the other agencies bring their part. But it also shapes what you do and how you engage people, and gives you a foundation for planning for impact, and ultimately creates a framework that you can use to track your contribution. So I'm going to get into that in a moment, and explain a bit more about that. But I thought it might be quite interesting to find out what's most relevant to you of those 5 ways of 5 mechanisms for research to have an impact. So I think you can choose. Can you choose? Yeah, you can choose more than one, or can you only choose one, Alex? What do you think?
Yep, you can choose
Choose
all
more
that
than one.
apply.
Yeah, okay. So please choose any or all that apply. If none apply, please put a comment in the chat, because I would love to know more about that. So we'll just give it a minute. We've got some responses.
Yep, just waiting for a couple more to trickle in. The last call, and then we'll share the results. Okay.
Right, so quite evenly spread. Yeah, pretty evenly spread actually. Slightly more on policy and practice influencing and community engagement, but pretty fair spread right across all of them. Did anyone leave a comment in the chat about something I haven't managed to think about? I'll come to that. I'll come to that in a minute, but I'd love to know. Well, thank you very much for doing the poll. And yeah, let's move on. So I want to move on now and talk about the second key, which is about people. So I think what's interesting about the role of people is that the more research on research impact and knowledge mobilization that happens, the more it becomes apparent that it's really about people and what people how people talk to each other, and what they, how they work together, and all these kinds of aspects, which maybe are slightly underplayed. Maybe we tend to focus more on the translation kind of parts than the actual relationship building parts of impact. And there was a fascinating study done quite a few years ago now, which I'm happy to share with the slides, where some people did an ethnography of a general practice, and they were looking at how did practitioners make everyday decisions. And they found out that the practitioners were more likely to use research if their colleague told them about it than if they read it themselves. So if someone comes in the morning and goes, oh, have you seen there's this new research on whatever, then they're more likely to go, oh, right, we should look at that, and kind of come to some conclusions about acting on it, than if they're just reading it themselves. So the people part of impact is so fundamentally important. And as I said earlier, most impact happens through indirect influence, not direct control. So you can control your research, you can control what you do, you can control some of your knowledge mobilization activities, you can decide who to engage, but really it's what happens after you engage that's as important as the engagement itself, because impact is going to happen, is what those people go and do as a result of this work. So we need to really target any uptake strategies to the right people. So it used to be the case that, especially when I started off in this field in the early 2000s, people would think, oh, we publish a paper and then we do a plain language summary, and this plain language summary is good for all. So it doesn't matter whether they're policymakers or practitioners or members of the public. The plain language summary was seen as the product. And now we know that actually what you might write for a practitioner might be very different from what you would write for a policymaker. or how you might share findings. You might share findings in much more imaginative ways that are really about targeting the people that you want to engage. So identifying your stakeholders is the foundation for planning, achieving, and assessing impact. Like, it's not possible to do any of those things without really thinking about who is important to your work. So I'm going to say a few things about how you identify who these people are. So you need to think about all of the people who are important to the change that you seek. So not just end beneficiaries, if you like, or not just partners, but if you think about the change you're interested in, what ultimately is your vision for change? Who needs to be involved in that change process? Or are people already involved in that change process and you could join in with what they're doing? So really thinking about this change process and who needs to be part of that. So there'll be some people that you directly engage with. There'd be some people that you might want to influence. Maybe you're never going to directly engage with the Prime Minister. I don't know who your friends are. Maybe you are, but you might want to influence some people. And then you might want some people who can also help with the change process, who care about the same change process, who want to be part of that process. I quite like to think about it on this kind of scale with the shaking hands end is the people that you actually know and meet. You look in their eyes, you shake their hands. So that would be your partners and other people if you host events or if you do co-production or all of the things you do that actually you meet, you're in the room with people. So they're your kind of the closer people that you need. And then furthest away, I've got the person with the megaphone because we tend to broadcast stuff out, don't we, on social media, through maybe events like this, which are more like people come and they're listening. It's less of a co-produced, or anyone who wants to know through the media, the traditional media as well as social media. So, people who might benefit from your research could also be in these big publics, but you're not really going to know them. And then in the middle, we have these other people, so the partners, and then the wider publics that relate to the partners. So let's say one of your partners is an organization that works with farmers. So obviously then the farmers are the wider public that's attached to them. And then also intermediary organizations, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So usually with most research impact, it includes a mixture of some wide kind of reach of telling the world, this is what we're doing to try and get people's interest and get them involved, and then some much more targeted work, which is who do we really need to be in the room with, how are we going to find them and make sure we're working more closely with them. And I quite like this diagram. It's not mine. It's from the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, which is here in the UK. It has been criticised for putting researchers at the centre. It's not meant to imply researchers are the centre of the world, but it's a really neat way of thinking about the sorts of stakeholders you might want to think about. And it's been done quite cleverly with this sort of circle where you go around it sort of morphs from one to the next sector. So we've got the public, the community third sector, the business community, international community, policy community, public sector. And so it might be, let's say you were doing some research about how swimming improves health. So you might have some culture and leisure services. So you would think of these, but you wouldn't just say culture and leisure services. You'd say, well, actually, it's these three leisure organizations in this place. Let's say, and then, so maybe there's the community that relates to that place. So you might have them as well. And then maybe it's some voluntary organizations and charities who are also interested in health and well-being, who you might include. So you could use this diagram to think about the different types of stakeholders, and each project would normally have like more than one type that they were involved in. And then I said I was going to say more about intermediaries, because I think sometimes researchers feel like, oh, it's so difficult. How am I going to reach the whole world? Like, you're not going to reach the whole world on your own. So if research producers are on this side, which is like all people producing research, whether they're at universities or not, and then research users are all these kind of people on this side, then there's a lot of other people in the middle. So if you want to reach nurses, then there's a professional body for nurses. If you want something to be in practice, sometimes it's good if it goes into an audit, inspection or scrutiny regime. So if your finding from your research gets into an audit regime, it means it will be there every single time that whatever it is audited. The media I already mentioned, sometimes advocacy groups who are interested in the same sort of change, or lobbyists. So it's really good to think about these people in the middle, because they can be real amplifiers of impact. And if they decide, oh yes, this research is really important to us, we need to, then they'll share it amongst their networks and talk about it amongst their networks. And that can be way more powerful than what you can manage to do with your own team. So when we're thinking about who should be engaged and involved, when we're thinking about this part of our work, it's really the foundation of our research uptake strategy, because what you're going to do is design outputs and engagement for the specific people who are important to your impact. So I was working with someone who had a project on the uplands in Scotland, so the sort of the hills and moors in Scotland. And so he designed some of his engagement to be walking in those hills and moors with some of the stakeholders who lived and worked there, because that made much more sense than getting them in a room and giving them a PowerPoint presentation. So it's really worth thinking about who these people are, and how you want to engage them in a way that's meaningful for them. But also, when you're going to say something about your impact, it's the basis for assessing like the reach of your work, having this really clear sense of who is involved and why. And then putting together that vision, like ultimately what difference do you want to make, and who is going to be involved, and your mechanism is the foundation for then understanding your impact. And you've got to bring your impact, how impact's going to happen, out of the kind of vague. It can't be vague, it's going to be really definite, so that you can then really think about it and learn about it. So for those of you coming to the workshop, it would be great if you could have already decided what your vision is and come up with who's important to that in terms of stakeholders and what mechanisms you're going to use, because that's what we're going to build on when we're in that workshop. So I want to spend this last part of the session talking about a framework for planning and assessing impact, because this is a lot of the work that I've done over the last maybe 10 years or so, and it does really help people get a lot of clarity about what is impact for them and how they might think about it and work with it and learn about it, and ultimately tell people about their impact, whether that's funders or stakeholders or anyone else. So you have a framework for impact because it sets out exactly how change might happen, how you hope change will happen. What is your best guess how your work is going to influence people, and how that's going to lead to some of the changes you care about. And by doing that, you're actually helping your planning process, because you're thinking through, okay, well, if we want to have an impact on this, actually, how is that going to happen? So what does that mean we should do? And it can help you really plan the sorts of knowledge mobilization activities that are going to be really helpful to the way you work. But the other thing about having a framework is it's something that you can use to learn and adapt as you go. So by setting out a clear framework, you can try things that are on it. And if the outcomes you hope for don't materialize, you can go back and try again, rather than just sailing on and then wondering when you get to the end why you've not had an impact. It's giving you some places to really sense check your work, which I'll show you in a moment. And it does frame research impact assessment. So I've done a lot of independent research impact assessments, and I've also helped quite a lot of people do their own ones. And having something that really makes research impact explicit for whatever initiative it is the foundation for doing that work. And hopefully you'll remember from earlier that I said the approach I use is based on contribution analysis. And I think one of the problems with research impact, not just with research impact, if any of you involved in charities or public sector organizations, it's a problem with any complex work, is sometimes people are trying to use attribution measures on something that is really not suited to it. So, we have an attribution model. It's used for drugs. I'm very pleased it's used for drugs. I don't really want to take a drug that hasn't been tested to show that it directly affects what it says it's going to affect. But that model, which comes from medicine and comes from sort of harder science, is not really suited to things like research impact, which are complex impacts. So when you're doing your knowledge mobilization activities, you're working in a system, and in that system, everything is changing quite quickly and unpredictably. And, the great example we all have now of unpredictability is suddenly there was a COVID pandemic, and maybe some of the things you'd been planning to do, you were no longer able to do. It was nothing to do with how good your plans were or how good your research was. It was to do with something completely beyond your control. So when we're working in this complex system, outcomes and impacts are not, we don't own them, we haven't caused them. So even if let's say you invent a disease cure, whether or not that gets taken up by a health system in your country or another country or locally or internationally is all to do with this complex system. It's not really to do with how good the disease cure is. It's to do with how expensive it is, and do people know about it, and what's the regulatory framework, and all of these other things. So on the whole, with research, we're influencing change. And what we're trying to do when we are to understand our impact is to understand what is our contribution to change. How can we highlight the thing that the research added to the change process? And in order to do that, we need to work in a way that's complexity informed. And so the approach I've developed, which is based on contribution analysis was invented by a Canadian, but it's been used quite a lot in Scotland. So it's a bit of a Canadian Scotland kind of initiative. It's gone back and forth a few times. So normally, so the way I would work is with this version, which me and my colleague Elsa Cook have been involved in developing. So we start off up at the top here. This is your vision. What's going to be better for people? Yeah. So ultimately, what change do you want to happen? And then we think about, okay, who are we involving and engaging, as I just discussed? So who's important to this change process? And then we think about, okay, well, what activities are we going to deliver to these people? So actually, it's a policy influencing process. So we're going to respond to a government consultation, and then we're going to host a round table or whatever your strategy is. And then we're working out what happens in between. So we're thinking about, well, how do people feel? And the reason we have this step in our model is because if people don't react well and think, oh yeah, this is really good. Oh, this will help me do my job. Oh, I trust you. Oh, this is credible. This is important. We must act on this. Then no other change is going to happen. But in a lot of these kind of theory of change models, this step is completely absent. But we know that impact rests on relationships. So we really scrutinize that process of people getting involved, and it becomes a way that you can demonstrate you did have a contribution because you're showing that you have engaged people meaningfully and that they're the right people. And then there's two further levels of outcomes we think about. One is what they learn and gain. So this is what knowledge, skills, capacities, or attitudes change. This is where research generally makes its big contribution because it's about learning, isn't it? Research is about knowledge. So this is where often research is making its big contribution. But then we've got to think about the so what question after that. So if people learn new things or gain new capacity through working with research, then what do they do differently? So what behavior is different, what practice is different, what policy is different. Hopefully that adds beautifully up to your vision. So those of you coming to the workshop, this is what we're going to be trying out for your research when we're in the workshop. But I was going to show you a couple of examples on how we then use this. So this is a completely bland research to action strategy using this model. Like it would never be this neutral. This has no topic in it whatsoever, but it can kind of give you an idea. You can think about your topic as you look at it. So ultimately, what difference do we want to make? The problems that whatever the research intends to address are influenced in some way and people benefit in some way. It's always going to be some sort of combination of these things. Who's going to be involved? Partners interested in our work, wider stakeholders, potential end users, people who could benefit, industry stakeholders, these kinds of people, as I've already discussed. What do? Well, we conduct research, we create partnerships, we carry out knowledge mobilization activities. And then how do we want people to feel? That it's relevant and useful, that the researchers are credible and trustworthy. This comes up very strongly in the research. And actually, if you come from an institution like the University of Toronto or all of the institutions you come from today, you carry that with you. The badge of the institution quite often gives you that credibility. they need to think it's going to help them in some way, really. Otherwise, then why would they get involved? They need to, it's going to help them in their job. It's going to help them do something or other. So what do they learn? They understand the issues in the research better. Maybe they build capacity to use research, particularly in kind of community, co-production. And you get these better links between researchers, policy, and practice. So you would never just say this if it was about if this was about the health and well-being example, you'd say we conduct research on health, how, whatever it is. And then here you'd say people understand how, and it would be very specific to your work. And then the research is used to influence policy or practice, etc. And we end up here. So the purpose of showing this one is just a very kind of process orientated that hopefully you could see yourself in. And I just wanted to say, if any of you look up my paper, this sort of research uptake, research use, and research impact kind of sits alongside this, if you like. So, what we do and who with is really about our research uptake. And then we're straying into people like changing their minds or being included into research use. And then these ones are much more about research impact. So I want to show you how we use this kind of framework to understand impact. So I'm going to go back to this one. So we set out, and these are always different. We set for every initiative. So you'll set out one of these for your initiative. With the Ag Act works, we set out one for the discovery phase, and we set out another one for the experimentation phase. So you can set these out at different levels for different kinds of things, but you're going to set out something like this for your initiative. And then you're going to think, okay, if this is how I see impact or how we see impact for our work, how are we going to know it's happening? So let's think about nearly always, I was saying, wasn't I, that research, it makes a big contribution to what people learn and gain. And it's normally around whatever the issues in the research are. So you want people to understand issues in the research better. How are you going to know if this is happening? Well, you might observe engagement and see people talking and thinking differently. You might get feedback from events or other kind of engagement about what did you learn? Do you understand XYZ differently? You might look at policy debate and see the way people are talking about an issue in the debate is influenced in line with your research. So you'd be asking, do we observe learning in line with research? You might ask people specifically what learning they would take away. You might ask them, do they feel better informed? I apologize about these lines that have gone in the wrong place. That's not supposed to be scored out. And then can you find evidence of that learning reflected in the debate? So I'm going to give you a real example now, not a theoretical one. So this is, I mentioned earlier about the people working on children's experiences online. It's an initiative of the London School of Economics and UNICEF. And they developed several pathways about how their work created an impact. And this was one of those pathways. And this is like a systems influencing pathway. It's a policy and practice influencing pathway. I'm not going to go into the detail, and I will share the slides with you afterwards, but you can see basically they've got these very big goals. All internet governance regulations have a child-specific lens. The industry takes more responsibility for children's safety, etc. So what did we do? We spent some time creating this map. You can see if you meet me in real life, you might work on a big purple sticky wall like this. If you meet me online, it will be a Miro board. So for those of you coming in a couple of weeks, it'll be a Miro board. And what we did was some documentary analysis, some stakeholders. So having created this with the team, we then went away and brought some data to it. And these were the data sources. So documentary analysis, stakeholder interviews, etc. And I'm going to show you kind of how they work across the map. So they had administrative documents that showed what they deliver. Normally, in terms of what you've delivered, this is quite a descriptive column. You'd just be saying what you've done, but also they kept records of who was engaged. So within their administrative documents, we could say something about both of these columns. It was in the days of Twitter, so social media was a bit of a different beast at that point, but in social media, through their social media report, you could see which of these kind of stakeholders were engaging in social media and what sort of things they were saying. So they'd reshare things that the team put out and say, oh, you should look at this because these people are experts, or, these kind of things. Then some interviews with some of the stakeholders. So who are you going to interview? UN agencies. people from the industry, people from civil society, governance bodies. So the who with column becomes your pointer to who you want to get data from. And we ask them, well, what was it that made you engage with this particular research? What did you learn? What are you doing differently? What difference is it making in your setting? And then finally, we looked up some policy documents. These were mainly like organizational type policy, a little bit of regulatory policies, to see, could we see any of these policy changes here? And then case studies can tell the story of the whole pathway. So for example, we interviewed someone from Google, a member of the industry, and we asked her, why did you Google get involved with this research? Like, what was it that made you engage? What did Google learn? What is Google doing differently? What difference is it making to Google? So through case studies, you can understand the whole pathway. So plotting out a pathway to impact helps focus on potential impact because you're being really clear about what you think, what difference you think you're going to make. It provides a way of planning for that. It also communicates what matters to the project. So it can be a great way of getting your partners together to say, okay, what impact do we think we're going to have? How can we create a shared vision for that? But also it provides a structure for thinking and learning about impact and creates a theory of change for evaluating impact. So in terms of your research impact assessment journey, I would say you need to create a vision for impact. You need to think about what are your main mechanisms. You need to identify who should be included and engage, and then develop a pathway to impact. And then you can use that to start to assess and narrate your contribution. So the difference that you want to make. So that was all that I wanted to say. I'm really happy to stay in touch with people, and we'll have some questions and discussion in a moment. We have written this method up in a book that you can find there, and I'll share in the slides is the paper that I wrote, which is specifically about research impact. But maybe I'll just stop there for now, and I'm really happy to have a bit more discussion.